London, 1898. On a rain-soaked night, in a street no one walks after dark, an old townhouse stands silent, except for the sound. At first, it's nothing more than a faint scratching beneath the floorboards. Then, the whispering starts. Voices, childlike, but wrong. The family who lived here swore they were alone. But neighbors told another story, that two pale faces sometimes appeared between the cracks, eyes wide, lips moving, though no one could hear the words. For 12 years, they stayed under there, breathing the damp air, watching, waiting. And if you listen closely, you might just hear them still. But don't kneel down to look, because if you do, they'll already be looking back. In the final years of the 19th century, London was a city of contrasts. The streets glistened under the dim glow of gas lamps, but just beyond the light, shadows crept and secrets festered. In the poorer districts, row after row of narrow brick houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their warped walls holding stories the world would never hear. And then there was the house on Holloway Street. To the casual passerby, it was nothing more than another tired, rain-soaked structure, peeling paint, cracked windows, a faint smell of mildew escaping through the doorframe. But to those who lived nearby, it was a place they avoided after dark. You see, there were whispers that if you stood still in the hallway, you could hear movement beneath your feet. Some claimed to hear laughter, faint, brittle laughter, like children playing in another room. But there was no other room. Of groceries left at the door, but never collected in daylight. Of strange, pale eyes glimpsed in the sliver between wood and shadow. For most, it was nothing more than a creepy tale told to keep children from wandering too far. But in the winter of 1898, the truth would come clawing its way out from under the floor and into history. This is the story of the children who lived beneath the floorboards for 12 years. From the outside, number 43 Holloway Street was unremarkable. Its brickwork had dulled to a lifeless gray. The paint along its doorframe peeled in thin, curling strips, and the windows, warped slightly from years of settling, reflected the streetlight in distorted fragments. But the longer you looked, the more you saw. The window panes were not just dusty, they were smeared, as though someone inside had pressed their hands, or perhaps their face, against the glass again and again. And though the rest of the street welcomed the faint glow of evening gas lamps, this house sat in shadow. The curtains never parted, not even during the day. When the front door opened, which was rare, the air that escaped carried a smell. Dampness, as though the very bones of the house had been soaking in cold water for decades. And beneath that, something sharper, something faintly metallic. Inside, the hallway was narrow, the kind of space where two people could not pass without brushing the wallpaper. Once patterned with flowers, had darkened and blistered with age. In places, it peeled away entirely, revealing the wooden boards underneath, their knots and grain warped into strange shapes, like faces frozen mid-scream. The floor itself groaned under the smallest step. Not the friendly creak of an old home, but a long, aching moan, as though the wood protested each intrusion. In the center of the front room, the boards bent ever so slightly, as though something beneath them pressed upward. Visitors, rare as they were, noticed it instantly. A subtle swell in the floor, the kind you might dismiss if you didn't know what was buried underneath. But locals whispered that it was not a flaw in the house. They said it breathed, that if you stood perfectly still, you could feel it shifting beneath your feet. The first owner to speak openly of it was a coal merchant named Thomas Green. He'd been invited inside for tea one late afternoon. And while waiting for his payment, he felt a vibration under the soles of his boots. Not from the street, not from a passing carriage, from directly beneath him. He described it later as a faint scratching, like nails against wood, paired with a slow, wet dragging sound, as if something or someone was moving through thick mud. He never returned to number 43. But others were less fortunate. The milk boy, tasked with leaving bottles at the doorstep, claimed that on more than one occasion, he heard laughter, muffled, high-pitched laughter, from somewhere inside. And one autumn evening, a neighbor swore she saw movement through a small gap between the warped boards on the porch. Two pale, dirt-smeared fingers curling upward into the light before retreating. Inside the house, the boards were uneven and brittle. They bore deep scratches, not the neat lines of carpentry, but jagged grooves, some short, others stretching the length of an arm, and between them, slivers of blackness. That blackness was not the harmless void beneath a home. It was thicker, as if the darkness itself carried weight. Standing above it too long brought a strange unease, as though something down there had noticed you and would not forget. Some swore they'd seen eyes, tiny pinpricks of reflection, catching what little light the room allowed. Always there, just for a second, before vanishing. The boards were not nailed down entirely. They could be pried up if one dared, but those who claimed to have tried told no one what they saw. Because here, beneath the floorboards of number 43, the air was not the air of London's winter. It was warmer, wetter, and it carried with it the sound of breathing that did not belong to the living above. Rumors in Holloway Street had a life of their own. They moved quietly at first, like a cold draft creeping under a door, and then spread until every corner of the neighborhood had felt them. It began with small observations. The woman in number 43 never opened her door unless it was completely necessary. She never greeted anyone in the street. On Sundays, when families dressed in their best clothes to attend church, her curtains remained tightly drawn. Then came the odd deliveries. A sack of potatoes here, a loaf of bread there, all left at the doorstep by a man no one recognized, and always collected only after nightfall. Children whispered about the strange smell that seemed to linger in the air whenever they passed the house. They described it as like wet earth mixed with something bad. One boy swore that when he kicked a stray ball against the door, he heard a soft gasp from inside, the kind that comes from someone caught watching when they shouldn't be. Adults weren't immune to the gossip either. At the bakery, Mrs. Faraday, a stern-faced woman known for her sharp tongue, told anyone who'd listen about the time she saw movement behind the curtain. It was small, she insisted. No taller than a child, but thin, too thin. And the way it moved, jerky, like it didn't know how to use its legs properly. Her story was met with nervous laughter at first, but it wasn't the only one. A chimney sweep claimed that while working on the roof next door, he heard faint tapping from inside number 43's attic, only for it to stop the moment he leaned closer. The milk boy, delivering bottles in the early morning fog, said he'd heard what he thought were two children arguing, their voices muffled but sharp, followed by an eerie silence, as if they'd realized they were being overheard. Perhaps the most unsettling account came from a local constable named Edwin Price. He had been called to the street on an unrelated matter, a petty theft, but noticed something peculiar as he walked past the old townhouse. From a narrow gap between two warped floorboards on the porch, he saw an eye staring back at him. Not a quick glance, not a startled look, but a steady, unblinking gaze. It was like looking into a well, he later told a colleague. You can't see the bottom, but you know something's there, waiting. The more these stories circulated, the more the house became a point of fascination. Children dared each other to step onto the porch after dark. Adults crossed the street to avoid walking too close. And the woman in black inside number 43, she became a figure of dread, imagined to be everything from a grieving widow to a witch who'd made some unholy bargain. But one rumor rose above the rest, whispered with a shiver, even among the most skeptical, that there were children living inside the walls and under the floors. It happened on a cold Thursday evening in late November of 1898. The sky was already black by 5 o'clock, the kind of darkness that seemed to come not from the absence of light, but from the presence of something heavy, pressing down from above. Thomas Barlow, a delivery man for a coal supplier, had been sent to number 43 with an overdue order. It was the first time he'd been asked to deliver there, and when his supervisor handed him the slip, he muttered, "Good luck." The house greeted him with silence. No footsteps inside, no voice calling out. Just the steady drip of rain from the roof onto the porch. He knocked twice, waited, then knocked again, harder this time. The door opened only a crack, and in the sliver of space stood a woman. She was gaunt, her face pale, and drawn tight, with dark circles beneath her eyes. Her black dress clung loosely to her thin frame. She avoided his gaze entirely. "Leave it inside," she said. Her voice, he hesitated. It was unusual for a customer to want coal brought directly into the house. But the cold in her tone brooked no argument. He stepped inside. The air hit him first. Thick, damp. There was a faint sweetness to it, like rotting fruit left too long in a cellar. He set the bag down near the hearth in the front room and turned to leave. That's when he heard it, a sound. At first, it was so faint, he thought it was the rain echoing under the boards, but then it came again, sharper this time. A scratching, not random, not like the scurrying of a rat. This was deliberate, slow, measured, like nails dragging across wood. He froze. The sound stopped. And then, almost imperceptibly, there was a breath. Long, shaky, and close. He looked down at the warped floorboards in front of him. In one place, the wood had separated just enough to create a thin, jagged gap. And from that gap, something shifted in the darkness below. His mind told him it was a trick, that his eyes were inventing shapes where there were none. But then, he saw it. An eye, small, wide, glassy, the pale blue of faded porcelain, ringed in shadow. It did not blink. It did not flinch. It simply stared up at him with a stillness that made his stomach turn. Before he could step back, another appeared beside it. The second was different, darker, the iris clouded as though filmed over. Both eyes locked on him. He wanted to move, to get out, but his legs felt anchored to the boards. His breath quickened. He glanced toward the woman, but she was gone. The door to the hallway now stood ajar, and from somewhere beyond it came a faint giggle. Not the bright, innocent laugh of a child at play. This was something else entirely. Slow, breathy, as though savoring the sound. Then came the whispering. It was too soft to make out the words, if they were even words at all. Just a sibilant murmur, sliding over itself in a rhythm that made his skin crawl. The eyes beneath the boards shifted slightly, following his every movement. And then, a hand emerged. The fingers were impossibly thin, their skin pale and almost translucent, veins tracing up from the knuckles. The nails were long, cracked, and dark with grime. They curled over the edge of the gap, like a spider testing its web. He stumbled backward, knocking over the coal sack. Black dust spilled across the boards, settling in the gaps. But the hand didn't retreat. It flexed, slowly, as if tasting the air. And then, from deeper beneath the floor, another hand appeared. This one smaller, the nails bitten down to jagged edges, the skin covered in faint scars. It reached toward the first, fingers tangling together for just a moment, before both withdrew into the dark. The whispering stopped. The scratching began again. Louder this time. Faster. he didn't wait to see what came next. Thomas turned and fled, the far too strong for the frail woman he had seen moments before. He never returned to number 43. And when he told his story later that night at the pub, no one laughed. No one even interrupted, because deep down, they believed him. Down here, the world is not made of days and nights. It is made of darkness and less darkness. The air never moves. It clings to the skin like damp cloth, heavy with the smell of rot, mold, and something else, something sour, as if the wood itself is decaying from the inside. In this space, the ceiling is so low that even a child cannot sit fully upright. The boards above form a jagged roof, their splinters catching at skin and hair. Beneath them, the earth is hard in some places, soft and wet in others, as though the ground remembers every drop of water that's ever seeped through. The children, 2 of them, learned early how to move without making noise. Every sound here travels. A cough can bring footsteps above. A cry can bring the hand that feeds, the hand that punishes. It would come through the same narrow gap, all lowered on a frayed length of twine. They never saw the face that belonged to the hand, only the fingers, pale, bony, quick to snatch away if they reached too fast. The first years passed slowly. They whispered to each other to keep from forgetting the sound of voices. They told stories in the dark, stories they barely remembered from a time before this one. One spoke often of the sun, of green fields, though the other could no longer picture either. As the seasons turned above, their world changed only in temperature. In winter, the cold was a living thing, creeping into their bones until their joints ached. In summer, the air grew thick and stifling, and the smell of their own unwashed bodies became unbearable. They marked time by the sounds from above. Heavy boots on the boards meant the woman was home. Lighter, hurried steps meant she was gone. Sometimes there were visitors, muffled voices they didn't recognize, laughter that was too loud. On those days, they didn't dare move at all. Hunger was constant, a dull ache that became part of them. Some nights, they would lie awake, their empty stomachs groaning, and imagine the taste of food they had once eaten. Sweet cakes, roasted meat. But the more they imagined, the more it hurt. Rats came often. At first, they were a terror, their scratching in the dark enough to send the children into a panic. But eventually, the rats became part of the silence. Sometimes they even left scraps behind, a chewed crust, a gnawed bone, that the children would take when desperation overcame disgust. Illness came too, a cough that rattled in the chest for weeks, fevers that made the darkness spin. There was no medicine, only waiting, and the quiet fear that one of them would wake to find the other cold and still. The longer they lived here, the more their senses changed. They learned to tell the difference between a step taken in anger and one taken in caution. They could smell the faint traces, candle smoke, long after the flame above had been snuffed out. And in the silence, they could hear each other's heartbeat. Sometimes, late at night, they would hear something stranger still. Voices that didn't come from above. They came from the earth. Faint at first, like the murmuring of water underground. But as they listened, they could swear the sounds formed shapes, syllables, almost words, spoken in a language neither had heard before. And though they didn't understand, they both knew the same thing. Whatever spoke below them was closer now than it had been before. The years passed, though they never knew how many. Their bodies grew, though the space did not, and soon every movement required twisting, folding themselves into the angles of the boards. Their skin became pale as bone. Their eyes adjusted so well to the dark that even the faintest glimmer of light seemed to burn. They stopped speaking of leaving, stopped speaking of before, the only they invented about the world above. A world they now imagined to be as much a prison as this one. And still, the hand came, with food, with punishment, with the unspoken promise that they would never be allowed to leave, until the day the boards shook harder than they ever had before. Voices shouted from above, voices they didn't recognize. Boots stomped across the floor. The woman's voice rose in a scream. Something heavy crashed, and for the first time in 12 years, dust rained down in a sudden, violent shower as the wood above splintered, and light, harsh, blinding light, cut into the dark. Her name was Eleanor Wren. In the neighborhood, she was a shadow, rarely seen in daylight, never heard at the markets, spoken of only in whispers. Some called her a widow, though no one had ever seen proof. Others claimed she had been a nurse once, during the cholera outbreaks, though no hospital records bore her name. When the boards above the children finally broke, and strangers with rough hands and loud voices pulled them into the blinding light, Eleanor Wren stood in the corner of the room, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. She did not weep. She did not shout. She simply watched. Those who were there said her eyes followed the children, the way a collector might follow a priceless object being carried out of their home. Not with love, not even with regret, but with possession. The authorities pressed her for answers. Why had she kept them there? Why had she never let them outside? Why had she hidden them at all? Then, in a voice dry as old paper, she spoke. "They are not ready," she said. When asked what she meant, she only repeated it. "They are not ready for what's outside." Some thought she was mad. Her thin frame and faraway stare certainly gave the impression. Others suspected darker motives, cruelty for its own sake, or the twisted satisfaction of control. But there were other details. Details that didn't fit neatly into madness or malice. A neighbor recalled that Eleanor had once been seen speaking to the ground behind her house, kneeling in the mud as though listening for something. The milk boy claimed that on more than one occasion, he saw her scatter salt in a perfect circle around the front steps before nightfall. And when the constable searched her kitchen, he found a bundle of papers, old, brittle, covered in diagrams and strange writing no one could identify. Eleanor refused to answer any questions about them. They didn't speak at all in those first days after being freed. Not to the constables, not to the doctors, not even to each other. When asked simple questions, their names, their ages, they would only stare. Sometimes they would glance toward the floor, as though expecting someone or something to come back for them. Eleanor Wren was taken away. She never returned to Holloway Street. But in the weeks that followed, strange things continued to happen in the house. Footsteps in the empty rooms, laughter echoing through the halls at night, and sometimes scratching, as if something was still down there, waiting. It began with a crash, the splintering crack of wood giving way under a heavy boot. The front door of number 43 had been forced open by two constables, their lanterns casting sharp, swinging beams across the hallway. Dust filled the air, disturbed for the first time in years. The wallpaper, already peeling, tore further as their shoulders scraped past. Upstairs, a single door slammed shut. Eleanor Wren's footsteps were frantic, the floor groaning under her weight. But in the front room, the real noise came from below. A rapid scratching, more desperate than ever before, erupted beneath the boards. It was joined by a muffled thud, then another, as if someone was striking the underside of the floor, trying to break through. The constables froze for just a moment, their eyes meeting. Then one of them dropped to his knees and began prying at the warped planks with a crowbar. The wood resisted, but it was old, and with each wrench, a narrow gap opened, enough for a burst of warm, foul-smelling air to escape. The stench was so strong that one man gagged, covering his mouth. Through the widening crack, pale shapes moved. First fingers, claw-like from malnutrition, then an arm, trembling with effort. "Easy now, easy," one constable murmured, as if speaking to a frightened animal. He reached down, gripping the thin wrist and pulling. The child emerged slowly, painfully, their limbs stiff and twisted from years of confinement. Their skin was almost translucent, stretched tight over fragile bones. A second child followed, crawling forward on hands and knees. This one's eyes darted rapidly around the room, adjusting to the light with visible pain. They made no sound, though their lips moved, as if forming words. Words no one could hear. Eleanor appeared in the doorway then, her face drained of all color. She did not rush forward. She did not beg. Knuckles whitened. The children looked up at her. For a moment, time stopped. Then, without warning, the older one let out a sound, not a cry, not a scream, but a low guttural hiss that froze the men where they stood. The younger joined in, their thin shoulders shaking with the effort, the sound rising until it seemed to vibrate through the floor itself. One of the constables swore he felt something in the wood beneath his boots. A movement, subtle but alive, as if dozens of unseen hands were pushing upward from below. "Get them out," the other barked. The children were carried from the house into the rain-soaked street, their heads twisting back toward the dark gap they'd left behind. Neither looked relieved, neither seemed free. Behind them, Eleanor Wren began to laugh. It was a brittle, broken laugh, and it followed them out into the night, lingering in the air long after the door to number 43 slammed shut for the last time. The events at number 43 Holloway Street spread quickly through London, traveling from tavern to market stalls, from whispered conversation to printed headline. The papers told one story: the rescue of 2 neglected children, held in squalor by a reclusive woman until the law intervened. It was an outrage. It was a tragedy. It was a crime. But the neighbors told another story. They spoke of the children's silence, how even in the care of doctors, they refused to speak, not a single word. How their eyes seemed to follow something no one else could see. How they would wake screaming in the night, clutching at their own skin as though something crawled beneath it. Eleanor Wren was taken to an asylum on the outskirts of the city. She died there less than a year later, though the official records did not state a cause. Some claimed she was found kneeling in the corner of her cell, head tilted as though listening for a sound only she could hear. Number 43 was boarded up. The furniture was removed, the floor repaired. But the new boards warped within months, bending slightly in the center of the room, as though something beneath pressed upward in the night. People stopped walking that side of the street. And even now, more than a century later, the house still stands, its windows dark, its door chained shut. The local children dare each other to step onto the porch, to press an ear to the wood. Some come away laughing, others come away pale, swearing they heard breathing. Some stories end when the villain is caught. Some end when the victims are freed. This one never truly ended. For over a century, number 43 has remained a silent shadow on Holloway Street. The boards inside may have been replaced. The rooms may stand empty. But if you listen closely, on a cold, wet night, you might still hear it. The scraping, the whispering, the quiet, shallow breaths of something that has been waiting a very, very long time. And perhaps it isn't waiting for them. Perhaps it's waiting for you. This was just one of the forgotten horrors buried in London's history. There are countless more, stories hidden in walls, beneath floors, and behind closed doors. Subscribe to this channel, and I'll tell you every one of them. But remember, once you hear them, you can't unhear them.